to end the sharing right now? Perfect. All right, so I'd like to welcome everyone back to our second plenary talk. And I felt a bit unsure whether it's really necessary to introduce Jim Orford, who I would say it's not an understatement to say that without his seminal work, we surely wouldn't meet today. Jim is a trained clinical psychologist and emeritus professor of clinical and community psychology at the University of Birmingham. And well, his publication list is overwhelming. So what I also think is important, he has conducted research on family-related topics in the addiction field since the 60s. But he's not only restricted to this point of view, but he also published a lot of books on also theoretical and political issues. And today he will be talking about mainstreaming work with affected family members. How far have we come and how far have we still to go? And I was looking forward to this talk, and I would like to hand over to you, Jim. And I'm very interested to hear what you have got to say.
Gallus, thank you very much. That's a very kind, generous introduction. Thank you for that. And Sari has very kindly agreed to relieve me of responsibility for sharing my slides. So thank you, Sari. And there's the first one. The two themes really to what I have to say. One is a personal theme, a little bit about my personal journey over the last little bit more than 50 years, actually, working in the field. But the more important theme that I want to interleave with that is the theme of whether we are being successful in getting to where we want to go. And I'm going to, in a way, present a challenge to us all to suggest that we have made a lot of progress, but we may not have been as successful as I would like us to have been in getting our work with affected family members mainstreamed. We're doing lots of good things, and goodness me, I mean, we've heard a lot about them yesterday afternoon and evening and this morning, and in the excellent series of webinars which have been organized. We've heard recently from people from Canada, from Finland, from Malaysia, from Indonesia. We've got somebody from Pakistan, I see, speaking later this morning. AFINet, as we've heard, now has over 500 members from 40 countries in all the regions around the world. So there's no doubt that enormous progress is being made. But are we managing to get our work into the mainstream? That's the challenge I want to suggest. Sorry, if I could have the next slide. This represents one of the things that we were up against when I first went into the field in the mid-1960s. And this was something that appeared in one of probably the most prestigious journal at the time, the Quarterly Journal of Studies in Alcohol, written by somebody called Whalen in 1953. And I think looking at that now, it does show an enormous amount of progress that we've made, not just in all the things that people are doing around the world, but actually in the way we're thinking about families affected by addiction. So here was Whalen in the Quarterly Journal of Studies in Alcohol saying, the woman who marries an alcoholic, and of course we were very happy in those days to talk about alcoholic. It was largely alcohol we were talking about, drugs had not really appeared on the scene much, certainly not in Britain at the time. And it was largely women, so it was largely marriages we were talking about. So the woman who marries an alcoholic is usually viewed as a helpless victim. This is certainly not true, Wayland says. Her personality was just as responsible for the making of this marriage as her husband was. She's not an innocent bystander. She's an active participant. Well, there's some truth in that, but it sounds to me, by modern standards, quite apart from anything else, blatantly misogynist. And particularly when you look at the 4 types of wives that she described, I seem to remember there was suffering Susan, and there was wavering Winifred, and there was controlling Catherine and punitive Polly. This was, by modern standards, this is pretty awful stuff. And it didn't go away. Some years later, in the really sort of 70s, 80s, there was an active program of research on alcohol problems and marriage, actually nearer to home, in Scotland, using a thing called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It was terribly popular at the time, the MMPI. And one of the subscales of the MMPI was a thing, if you can believe it, called the Psychopathic Deviant Scale. And so called because psychopaths scored particularly highly on the PD scale. And this was being used to look at women who were married to alcoholics who were in treatment. And the conclusion was that if you were an alcoholic and you were unlucky to be married to a high PD wife, then your chances of overcoming your alcohol problem were considerably diminished. So this was, this sort of thing was still going on several years later. If I can have the next slide then, sorry, please. And this is, if I can talk about one of our most famous poets in the English language, the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. Here's something that was said by the biographer Paul Ferris, a very well-known writer some years ago, who wrote a lot of very interesting and good books. He'd written a biography of Dylan Thomas, who, of course, as most people know, died very prematurely. I think he was 39. He had a very serious drinking problem by all accounts. And Paul Ferris wrote a biography of Courtleen. I think she was Irish in background, so I think Courtleen is probably nearer to the correct pronunciation of her name, although Dylan called her Kathleen, or even Cat for short. And what Paul Ferris said about Courtleen was, if Thomas in the last years of his life is to be seen as a man adrift, it's hard not to see Courtleen as one of the reasons. The anger she displayed was another element in his downfall, which in turn made him reckless with his life and would lead to his death. So here we are, here's a wife coping, and she wrote, interesting enough, she wrote books after Dylan had died. She wrote books about her experience of living with him. And there are many, many elements that we would recognize and are very familiar to us in her experience of being a wife of someone with a serious drinking problem. But here's a serious biographer saying that she was one of the elements that led to his premature death. And a more recent example actually is Amy Winehouse, and she was another well-known person, well-known artist, a singer, of course, who died prematurely, having had an alcohol and drug problem. And the family have been vilified by all accounts in a film. There's a film called Amy, and particularly her father, Mitchell, Winehouse, who read a very interesting book himself after his daughter had died, and he's come in for a great deal of criticism for the way he's behaved. So if I can have the next slide, please. Actually, before I go on to this, it's just worth saying that on the personal level, one of the things that I wrote came out 10 years ago was a book called Addiction Dilemmas, Family Experiences in Literature and Research, because I've found that there are lots of nuggets of gold when it comes to understanding the family member experience in literature, in things that biographers have written, autobiographies that are written, and even fictional accounts, when they are written by people who clearly know what they're talking about. I mean, one example that came to mind very much yesterday, when we were hearing about some of the work in Scotland, and particularly there was a very moving film that we were shown yesterday evening about Scottish young persons group and young people, teenagers, young adults, talking about what it was like. And it very much put me in mind of a book that won the Booker Prize, this prestigious prize for fictional work in the English language. It won it 2 years ago. It was called Shuggie Bain, set in Scotland, written by Douglas Stewart, and particularly about a young boy whose mother had a drinking problem, and he knew what he was talking about. It's a work of fiction, but he knew what he was talking about because he himself had a mother with a drinking problem. Anyway, that's all. That's all where we've come from, and I do believe our thinking is now a lot more appropriate than it was. In fact, when Whelan was writing in the early 1950s, there was someone else writing also in the Quarterly Journal of Studies in Alcohol, Joan Jackson, who was starting to use the idea of coping, and the idea that really what family members were facing was a really stressful experience. And she talked about stages of responding to the stress. That was very early days. I actually met her very briefly in New York some years later, and she was very supportive of the work that we were beginning to do, developing a stress coping model. When I worked in London in the late 1960s, early 1970s. In fact, some of the I don't know whether I suppose I'm pleased or perhaps slightly appalled that we're still using the coping questionnaire or bits of the coping questionnaire that we were developing over 50 years ago. And I have a feeling that some of the items that are now asked of people in the coping questionnaire or bits of the family member questionnaire are actually items that we were developing over 50 years ago. But there you go. Anyway, the challenge that I want to throw out is this, that despite the rise of an alternative stress coping type model, of which the stress strain coping support model is just one type, we have not succeeded in getting our subject into the mainstream. That's the challenge. And you may disagree with me. You may think that actually there's so much work going on that we are winning. We are getting, it takes time. Rome wasn't built in a day, after all. We are getting it into the mainstream. But I would argue there's good evidence that having an addiction problem in the family remains a specialist subject. And since addiction itself is a specialism, in a way, the work we are doing is a specialism within a specialism. It continues to be ignored by policymakers, it's marginalized by services, and it's neglected by the academic community. Next slide, if I might. Sorry, please. Just on the policy angle, one of the projects that we attempted in AFINet just 2 or 3 years ago was to analyse government alcohol, drug, gambling policy documents. And we analysed 36 such documents that came from 8 different countries. Sometimes it was just about alcohol, sometimes it was substances, sometimes it included gambling, sometimes it was just gambling. So there was a mix of type of document. And of course, we were looking specifically about the recognition of what I called CAFMs. That stands for concerned and affected family members, which I think is although it's a bit of a mouthful, I think that's an appropriate way of designating family members. They are concerned and they're affected, both of those things. And what we found in the documents was disappointing, frankly, very disappointing. Either family members weren't mentioned at all, or they were only mentioned simply in name, and there was no special section or focus on them, or they were mentioned, but they were really peripheral to the main concern of the documents. Or if they were mentioned specifically, it wasn't followed through with any detail. Or finally, when families were mentioned, it was mostly children who were the focus. And of course, that's wonderful, that's great, that's excellent, but it was in many cases confined to a focus on children. So policy-wise, I'm not sure we are winning. I don't think we're managing to mainstream our work on the policy side. The next slide is about services. What I would say here is that a number of us, and I'm thinking of Lorna Templeton, Richard Velleman, Alex Capello, a number of other colleagues, at one time put in an enormous amount of effort to get services to involve family members, addiction services. And sometimes they were National Health services, sometimes they were charitable third sector organizations. And we worked, because the work was very intensive, we worked generally with a small number of services over quite a long period of time. And when I look back and I see some of the reports that we wrote and some of the papers that we published, I recall the meetings that we held, the feedback sessions we held. It was an enormous amount of work. And we also, at the same time, tried to do work in primary care with doctors, practice nurses, health visitors. And also we were able, certainly in Birmingham, where I was working then, we were able to do some work with Black and minority ethnic services as well. And we did make some progress. I think I'm sure Lorna and Richard would want to say, and I would certainly want to say, that we made some progress. But the progress was with a small number of organizations. One could never quite be sure whether the gains that were made were followed through, how sustainable they were, whether they were sustainable in the face of times changing, policy changing, new managers, staff leaving, new staff coming. So the sustainability was never assured. And although people in the services were able to talk about lots of ways in which they felt they'd benefited from the work that we did, trying to get them to involve family members more, there were always concerns. And to some extent, we overcame these concerns. But I think these are probably concerns that remain for most people running addiction services, or that would be my expectation, that wherever you go and you talk about the need to involve family members, these are some of the concerns that people will bring up. It should be the focal client's decision, the focal client being the person with the substance problem or the gambling problem, who the services like to consider to be their main clients. It should be their decision. And if family members get involved, that might be a negative experience for the focal clients. Family members anyway may see it as just the focal client's problem, and they may just want us to fix the substance problem. They may not want anything beyond that. And anyway, it may be difficult to handle anything that comes up. Conflicts may come up. We're not trained. We're not competent to handle other problems that may emerge. And then finally, the old chestnut of confidentiality. And this comes up repeatedly. Are we going to get ourselves in a really difficult position with confidentiality? Aren't family members going to want to know things that we shouldn't be free to tell them? So a lot of work went into it. Some gains, limited gains, I would argue, and undoubtedly concerns remaining. The next slide. Oh yes, this is just briefly a bit to go back to kind of, you know, the stories that people tell in the media. I was very struck by this recently. We had very recently on British television. We had the singer Will Young talking about his twin brother's alcohol addiction and suicide. And he talked very movingly about that and how stressful it had been for him, and how he felt he'd not been able to do as much as he felt he'd like to have done for his twin brother. But he used this expression, which I was very taken with this, so I wrote it down, and here it is. It wasn't because he was asked, it's taken your brother's suicide for you to tell this interesting story. You didn't tell it earlier. And he said, it wasn't my story to tell. And I thought that was a very interesting remark. And we've heard quite a bit in the presentations that have been made already this morning about the difficulties that family members have in accepting services, reaching out to services, talking to people about what's going on. And I thought this was a rather interesting example, and I think I know what he means. It wasn't my story to tell; it was my brother's story to tell. And we talk a lot about stigma, but I think the feelings that family members have that make it difficult for them to access any services that may exist, and goodness knows, you know, the services are not often not there as they should be, but the difficulties that family members have reaching out to services, accepting services, may be due to coercive control that they're under, which was mentioned earlier this morning. But I think there are all sorts of reasons. Anyway, the next slide is something near to my heart, because this is about the lack of progress we're making on the academic side. Because as Gallus kindly said, I'm a writer and on the subject, researcher, academic. So the progress that we might be making in convincing our colleagues in the academic addiction field that family members are important is really important. And so recently I was asked to review this book, edited by Nick Heather, an old friend and colleague, Nick Heather, and his colleagues, about evaluating the brain disease model of addiction. And this is a big book. I've got it here. It's an enormous tome. I've actually read every word of it, I'm proud to say. I think reviewers don't always read every word of the books they're asked to review, but I've read every word of this book. It's an absolute goldmine of interesting stuff about addiction. So if you're interested in sort of up-to-date thinking about all the ins and outs of, you know, what on earth is addiction? How should we think of it as a brain disease model? Well, the editors think not, but if we don't think of it as a brain disease, you know, what is it exactly? How should we be thinking of it? Well, obviously one of the things it's got 40 chapters. It comes from many countries. I'd strongly recommend, as I said in my review, I'd strongly recommend this book. But obviously one of the things I was looking out for was mention of the family. And I have to tell you, it was utterly disappointing. I mean, I think if I found 3 mentions of the family in this whole book of 500 pages, then I think that was about it. I might have missed one, but I think, you know, it was of that order, and they were very short. They were a sentence or two in each case. So here's this book, 500 pages, about addiction, and scarcely a mention of the family. And when the family was mentioned, it was often mentioned in a way that reminded me of some of the things that were being written in the 1950s and 1960s. So here's one of them. And I regret to say, I won't tell you what the author is, but I regret to say this was actually one of the editors. It wasn't Nick, but it was one of the other editors in a chapter who said this. And this is all that was said about the family. Too often, well-meaning family members and friends try to insulate individuals from the consequences of their behavior and thereby miss an important opportunity to help the addict quit. Well, okay, we know there's a certain truth in that, but too often well-meaning family members and friends, well, we call this damning with faint praise in English. I'm sure you have similar expressions in other languages. Well-meaning family members and friends. Huh. Okay. Very disappointing, I thought. So we're not mainstreaming our work in the academic addiction field any more than we are, I think, in policy and in services. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the remainder of what I've got to say is in the nature of suggestions about what we might do differently. How might we move beyond what I say we, what I have been doing? I mean, if we've not been doing quite the right thing, I take major responsibility for this as someone who's been working in the field for a long time. So what have I been doing wrong? How can I move beyond? How can I encourage us all to move beyond what we're doing at the moment to try and mainstream our work better, to try and get the policymakers, the services, the academic side of things recognize better family members and the experiences they have and what they need in the way of support. And those are some of the suggestions I've got to make, that we move beyond what we're doing at the moment or add to what we're doing at the moment in these particular ways, beyond specific named interventions, beyond existing services, beyond the addiction specialism, beyond high income countries, beyond the current AFINet model, indeed, beyond trying to help families change even. So those are my challenges. So if I can have the next slide, please. This, I'm sure you recognize, is a dodo bird. And the dodo bird is extinct in the real world, but not in Alice in Wonderland, one of the English language's most loved classics, loved over the years by children and adults alike. And Alice, when she finds herself in Wonderland, meets a number of very strange characters, one of whom is a dodo bird. And the dodo bird runs races for some of the characters to be found in Wonderland, but they're very strange races. There are all sorts of hurdles, and there are all sorts of handicaps. And when Alice says, well, who's won? It's all very confusing, this race. Who has won? The dodo bird says, well, everyone has won, and all must have prizes. And this idea of the dodo bird effect has been taken up in something called the Great Psychotherapy debate. And it's been used to refer to the fact that people adhere very strongly to specific interventions. So I was brought up as a clinical psychologist in the behavioral tradition, and I was led to believe that the behavioral tradition was wonderful, and the psychotherapeutic, psychoanalytic tradition was awful, and one was pitted against the other. Fortunately, sense has prevailed since then, and it's been found that actually it isn't the name of the specific intervention that's important. There are general characteristics, often to do with the relationship that a counselor, a therapist, a helper forms with the person being helped or being counseled. Often it's to do with other circumstances. It may have to do with how enthusiastic the helper feels about the particular method they're using. So method may be important in many ways. If the therapist feels well trained, really enthusiastic about the method, that's important. But at the end of the day, the actual name of the treatment, whether it's behavioral, whether it's psychotherapeutic, whether it's compassionate therapy, whether it's something else, that is not the important thing. And I think almost certainly that will be the case when we come to methods for helping family members. And we had a very good example of that today. Earlier on today, we were hearing about the breakthrough program from AFINet, talking about the work that Turning Point in Melbourne in Australia are doing. And I think we recognized, when in the discussion, we recognized that although that wasn't based on the 5-step approach, which is something that's close to many of us within AFINet, it had many similarities to it. And I think we recognize that. And I think we have to decide, if I can go on to the next slide, leave the dodo bird behind for a moment. And if we are going to reach more concerned and affected family members, I think we have to do a number of things. I think we have to raise awareness. We have to raise awareness in non-specialist organizations. We probably should use much more modern modes of communication, whether it's chat boxes or telehealth or whatever it is. And we need to reach family members at an earlier stage. But one of the questions that I would ask is, are we going to raise awareness and get the work that we're interested in doing disseminated more widely? Are we going to do that by pursuing a particular form of named intervention? Or, because I think the danger's in that, I think if you start saying, yeah, we're going to use, we champion method A, and we'd like you to use method A in your services, some people are going to say, well, awfully sorry, but we've already been trained in method B. And we're method B advocates here, so it's going to be really difficult to bolt on your method A. And the other thing which I think is happening is that if you say, yes, we think method A is the answer, then people are going to say, well, does method A work? And they're going to say, how many controlled trials have you done? And you're going to have to say, well, we've done loads of work all around the world. We've done loads of work, and we've got loads and loads of examples of it working really well. And people take it up and they say, yeah, but you haven't done any controlled trials. And that, I think, is a danger if you go for named interventions. And I was rather taken. I think it was one of our webinars that we had from Scotland by Justina Murray, who was talking about the work they're doing, Scottish families affected by alcohol and drugs. I think we've had 1 or 2 presentations from that. But she was talking about family support and family inclusive practice, was the expression that I wrote down when I was listening to her webinar. And I wonder whether, instead of going for a named intervention, we should go for family support and family inclusive practice, because that doesn't require you to answer the question of, does a particular method work? Because if you can raise awareness that something needs to be done in this area, then people are going to accept that, yes, there should be family support and there should be family inclusive practice. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I think if we're going to mainstream work with family members, this is a dilemma for us. I think it's a decision we've got to take as to what is going to be our policy. What are we pushing? Are we pushing a particular methods, or are we pushing a general family support and inclusive practice method. I think that's a dilemma for us. I think I'll probably miss the next slide, Sari, as time is getting on, and go on to this one. One of the better things that I think I've written over the years and was a paper going right back. I think it was 1975. I wrote a paper called Alcoholism and Marriage, the Argument Against Specialism. And what I was trying to say then, and I repeated that message for quite a while, was that we shouldn't just be talking to each other. Those of us interested in addiction and how families are affected by addiction. There's lots of other people who are doing really interesting, very similar work with other kind of conditions. And I have to say that when I look back at things that I've written, I realized that I carried on saying that for quite a while, and somehow it got lost. And I sometime around the 1980s, 1990s, I stopped saying that. It didn't appear in the things I was writing. And I think that was a mistake, because there are loads of other types of harm, hardship, stress. Some of them are illnesses in the family, some of them are disabilities in the family, sometimes it's domestic violence, sometimes it's other things altogether, like unemployment or war, war trauma, or a husband coming back from serving in combat and coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder. There are all sorts of other things. And I wrote I edited a book in, I think it was 1987, I think, called Coping with Disorder in the Family. Not, I think, a very happy title, actually, looking back. Not one of my brilliant ideas about a title for a book. But it had a number of colleagues in Exeter, where I was working at the time, wrote chapters about family members affected by disabilities, childhood disabilities. Other people wrote about schizophrenia, about depression, and so on. And I think there's loads of other people out there who are actually finding very similar things. One of the magazines I continue to take is the British Psychological Society's magazine, The Psychologist. And I keep on seeing things in there by people writing at all sorts of similar things. One that I remember of 2 or 3 years ago was somebody writing about childhood cancer and what it was like for siblings in families where there was a child with cancer. And what this person said was she decided, from her experience as a clinical psychologist working in that area, she decided there were 3 things that siblings needed when they were in those conditions. One was good information. One was advice about how to cope, and the other was good social support. Well, haven't we heard that somewhere before? Aren't those things pretty central to our beloved stress strain information coping support model? So I think my argument here would be that if we want to start mainstreaming, we should really get together with other people who are doing work in other areas. I don't think on the whole we're doing that. I mean, there isn't. It was interesting. We had something this morning about people who had facing in the family gambling problems and Parkinson's disease. I mean, that was very interesting. But on the whole, we are not talking to other people who are concerned about depression in the family and how that affects family members, schizophrenia and so on, disabilities and all the rest of the things that have lots of similarities. And I think we should start inviting them to our conferences, and we should start linking with them and getting away from talking to ourselves all the time is one suggestion. Right, if I can, the next slide, time is getting on, and I need to speed up, I think, or shut up before too long. One of the experiences for me that has been really formative in my time is taking an international perspective. I spent a little time at the World Health Organization, reviewing some of the literature and making a proposal for research that could be done. And then that was followed by a sabbatical period in Mexico, working with Guillermina Natera and Marcela Tiburcio and colleagues who were speaking yesterday at the conference. Really interesting to hear their present perspective on the work they've been doing in Mexico. That was a really formative experience there. And then subsequent work that I and others, Richard and other people have done in Aboriginal communities in northern Australia, 3 regions of Italy, working with colleagues in Brazil, large sample of concerned and affected family members interviewed in Brazil, and with Sikh families in Birmingham in England, and then also having some privileged access to records of interviews from Nigeria, thanks to Akanibanga, who did his PhD in Birmingham and then went back to Nigeria, and through the Sangar Center in Goa in India, also able to look at some interviews there. And I think what I would say here is, just to cut a long story short, is that for a long time, I think I and others claimed that families facing addiction problems looks the same everywhere, and we said it's the same thing. You go to Brazil, you go to Aboriginal Australia, you find basically the same thing. I think that was right up to a point, but I think that was somewhat misleading, and I think there are lots of differences that need to be taken into account. Just 2 of them. In the Aboriginal communities in Australia, the way in which the problem was very obviously a public community problem, and indeed very much a political problem. How was alcohol going to be dealt with in Aboriginal communities in Australia? It wasn't a private, not only a private family affair, it was very much a shared community affair, and that put a very different perspective on it. The role of religion in Nigeria, when people were coping, religion is very important in people coping with addiction in the family in Nigeria, and so it was. Recently we heard in a webinar from one part of Indonesia, religion in coping was very important. On the next slide just summarizes 3 conclusions that I came to when reviewing the work that we've done over the years in different countries as to how it varies. And I concluded that the family member experience was different, and it was more difficult to cope with, and the level of strain was higher. In other words, the burden was higher when there were other burdens to cope with. And this was very clear, for example, in Goa, women often in extended families, and there were very often other disabilities and illnesses to cope with in the family at the same time, where people are in positions of structural subordination and dependence, women and children particularly, and particularly women living in cultural groups where a higher value is placed on hierarchy. Guillermina and Marcelo were talking about the extent of machismo in the indigenous rural community in Mexico where they'd been working, and also when good quote social support is lacking. So those 3 things make a lot of difference to the experience. It's not always the same. So if I can go on to the next slide, and I'm nearing to the end. The other this is very much work in progress. Don't take the details of this too seriously, but my suggestion is that we should expand the stress strain coping support that many of us have been very attached to, and which I certainly played my role in developing and pursuing. And we should develop it in a number of ways. We should recognize there are additional burdens, that it varies, that people need support, and the support is perhaps the central thing, not just one element. It's the central thing. And on the left hand side, I've tried to depict the wider the wider elements here, the socio-cultural norms and beliefs, the public attitudes and awareness, and government and our need. The thing, perhaps one thing I should point out about this is I think the word awareness appears 3 times. I realise services should be aware, the public should be more aware, government should certainly be more aware. So I would want us to put much more emphasis on awareness, all the way from family members themselves through services, right up to government and politicians, that we should be going much more for making everybody much more aware and not spending all our time actually helping family members. So that, I think, is a bit of a challenge to what we do. I'm certainly not suggesting we should stop what we're doing, but that we need to go beyond what we're doing and raise awareness. And I think that leads probably to maybe my last slide, which is the next slide. Have we got a next slide there? Yes, these are just some campaigning groups, and one, Gambling with Lives is one I'm very familiar with. They've made, by getting to politicians, senior politicians in Britain, they've made more of a difference to getting politicians to realize that we need change than all the rest of us had done in a number of years before that, campaigning about the need to change gambling regulations. And we can now add to this Sheila Gilheeny's excellent work we heard of just earlier on, about alcohol addiction in Ireland. And I was very taken with what you were saying, Sheila, about the importance of partnerships and linkages. And I think we should be doing much more linking, much more developing partnerships. So that really is where I want to end. There's a further slide later on about references, but I think, as has been said already, this will all be on the website and all available. So I won't bore you with looking with references just now. But so a challenge, not suggesting we stop what we're doing, but I think we should go beyond what we're doing, is my message. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim, for this very excellent and inspiring talk. And there have been a lot of comments already in the chat, but so far I would not interpret them as questions. I have several questions and comments, but I'm sure also other people from the audience have some. So I would so just raise your hand if you have any questions or comments. But I'll take the privilege to start with the first question, and I'd be very interested in 2 things. One thing is, I think in the overview you gave, one important issue regarding awareness might also be to consider the role of interpersonal bonding, as we see it with other diseases. And I usually, in Germany, when I try to, deconstruct the model of codependency, I always say we do not have a concept of co-schizophrenia or similar things. So I think it's almost natural that people suffer if someone close to them or someone they're affiliated with is in a kind of self-destructive mood. And maybe closely allied to this, the second question is, what do you think about the potential impact of the harm to others approach, which is driven by the World Health Organization? To what degree might this be helpful in order to raise awareness?
Yes, well, two tricky questions there, Gallus. Thank you. Yes, the first one, I mean, just taking schizophrenia. I mean, at one time there was a concept of the schizophrenogenic mother, you may remember. And quite a long time later, there was a very strong, much followed program of research on expressed emotion by family members. So if family members were critical or if they were over controlling, then it was thought that people with schizophrenia had less chance of recovering. So again, you know, the blame seemed to be placed upon the family members. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your first question really, but I certainly think that the stress coping models generally, I think, are right. I mean, I think they are a much better place to be thinking about all these things than pathology models, of which codependency is a modern variety, I think, of pathology models. So I think the idea of interpersonal, I forget exactly how you put it, but interpersonal, yes,
bonding.
Interpersonal bonding. Yeah, sure. Yeah, yes, I would agree. And just remind me your second point again. Your second question was, just quickly.
Harm to
others.
others.
Yes. The WHO approach of harm to others. Well, I think that's. I think that relates into what I was saying in terms of trying to reach people earlier. So if you, that's something that people have often said to us in our work. Oh, you know, this is all very good. I wish I'd known about this 10 years ago. I wish I'd known about this at an earlier stage. And to some extent, the work WHO and people working under that banner in different countries have been doing, I think, is partly about sort of early stage problems, rather earlier than most of us would be familiar with when we're dealing with people where things have really got seriously stressful for the family. But also the harm to others WHO approach, I think, goes well beyond families. That's the thing. I mean, in the work they've done, I think they say, yeah, so many people in this community say they experience some harms from other people's drinking, for example. You find that actually most of it is people being fed up with noise that, you know, drunken groups create in the community. And so it's yes and no. I'm not quite sure really about the harms to others approach. I think it's a bit too broad for us somehow. But again, if we're talking about linkages, you know, maybe that is an important linkage we should be making.
Okay, thank you. And I see that Jan and Ed have raised their hands. There are also some questions in the chat, so it would be good if you could keep it brief, since we have got only 7 minutes to go.
Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation. Thanks. I guess my question is about, it seems to me that a lot of the family awareness raising is based on a kind of group of passionate individuals. And that's kind of what I've experienced over the years in terms of passionate individuals will champion working with family members. And then obviously they move to other organizations and then that kind of dies away. And I just suppose, I don't know if there's any sort of direct answer to this, but what are your thoughts about how to move from passionate individuals into more structural awareness about working with family members?
Well, I don't have any simple answers, obviously, to your important question, but I do think I'm very taken with this idea of making linkages and partnerships, which Sheila was talking about earlier, and I think there are just lots of passionate people around. I mean, you know, we're very passionate about our bit of things, but there's lots of people who are terribly passionate about families and cancer, and lots of other people who are very passionate about families and Parkinson's disease, and other people who are very passionate about families and dementia, or, you know, families and depression. So I can't help feeling those are some of the linkages that I think we could make most easily. I think next time we have a conference, I think if we invite, you know, at least one person who's passionate about a a field that's very closely related to ours and would share a lot with us. And of course, there's I'm very conscious that Ed is here, Ed Sipler and Lorna, I imagine is here too. And of course, the Northern Ireland Steps to Cope program has always been, as I understand it, a program for young people affected by drinking problems or by mental health problems or by both. And that's just an example of, I think, the way in which it might go. That's just one way ahead, I think.
Okay, so Ed, you also have a
Jim,
question.
As always, thought-provoking conversation. You raised an issue about raising awareness using other platforms, and I wonder, how do we do this more in AFINet? I mean, even in the 2 days of the conference, I heard of resources I'd like to look at. I mean, we heard yesterday a way to explain detox to the kids and addiction, the kids in Germany. That video this morning, a clip about gambling and recovery, was really powerful. Last year's conference, I put out that YouTube clip that we had for family members with the pocket guide for family members. It sits on the AFINet website, and with the invitation to translate it. And I think our colleagues in Italy, did reach out and translate it. I have that in Word, in English. Anybody can translate it to any other language. I think the challenge is, how do we share more, across our AFINet family? How do we encourage that sharing, linking together, and using each other's material rather than all this keep reinventing the wheel?
Yes, I'm also very struck with that, Ed, that actually we hear, just in the last 24 hours, we've heard lots of stuff, and lots of people are producing material, and there's lots of commonalities, and so I think certainly somehow pulling together that, and perhaps, as I've been trying to suggest, pulling things together from closely related fields, not just perhaps the addiction field, is something we need to do. But also, I know that AFINet has been talking about new trustees. We've got a number of trustees, and there's room for other trustees. Should we be recruiting to AFINet people who are not necessarily experts in our precise field, but actually know what they're talking about when it comes to raising awareness and campaigning?
Yeah, that's good. And you put an idea in my head for another AFINet project, a sharing platform, a sharing resource. That would be an interesting project.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, we already have the platform on the website, so I think an important issue might be to expand it. But Ola has raised his hand as well. 2 minutes to go.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and thank you for all the work you've done in this field for many, many years. Just a reflection, I conducted a study where we tried to reach people who shared a child with someone who has a drinking problem, try to reach them at an earlier stage of the development of AUD in the co-parent, so to speak. We only managed to recruit 76 participants over a course of 3 years when we advertised in social media. Most that sought to this study had much larger problems than what the program was intended for. And we made interviews with 15 of the participants in the study, and they almost all of them said the same thing. One of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of this was to try and understand, am I in need of support? Because it was always the husband in this case. He doesn't drink like an alcoholic. He doesn't have that large issue with alcohol. So I'm not sure if I'm entitled of any support. And when they were describing the situations they were living in, of course they were entitled of support. But Yeah, so more of a reflection that maybe also we need to talk more about what is alcohol problems. I mean, not the binary alcoholic, non-alcoholic, but rather the scale of alcohol problems to get that message out into the society as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Ola, for that really interesting point. The slide actually that I skipped over because there wasn't time, was I was going to talk about a major research project that I was involved in Birmingham some years ago, which was a 10-year study of untreated heavy drinkers. So these were people, all of whom were drinking excessively above recommended health levels. And we interviewed a subsample of their family members, and so these were not people who'd gone anywhere near treatment at all. They were just really from the community, but we knew there was someone in the family who was drinking excessively. And although some turned out to be very like the kind of people we're very familiar with from our research with families who are very seriously affected by drinking problems, the predominant impression we had of how they felt about their family members' heavy drinking was one of ambivalence. And they were ambivalent for a number of reasons. They were ambivalent sometimes because they thought that the drinking had actually benefits. It had a lot of downsides, but it also had benefits. Sometimes it made the family member better, easier to be with for a while. It was a joint social activity sometimes, but sometimes it was because they themselves were quite heavy drinkers. So I think for a number of reasons, if one's actually going to increase the access, then we're going to find that the population of people who are being helped are much broader. We are dealing with, then we're not just dealing with alcoholism or alcohol problems or substance use. We're actually dealing with heavy alcohol consumption in society, and how family members cope with that. So I think it's very pertinent, the question you ask. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is, but it would take us into new territory.
Wonderful. So we've already exceeded the time frame. So thank you all very much. And there are more than 20 comments and other issues in the comments function. And I think this also brilliantly shows how networking is moving forward. But now I would like to hand over to